Welcome to another broadcast from MindYourHealthcast.com. Now, as you probably know, for the last couple of sessions, actually 3 sessions, we've been talking about energy and information and how all of this relates to the body and health. And so we mentioned last time that we were laying the final foundation to introduce to you some information related to something called SAF. And SAF actually was a term coined by Joseph R. Sconia Jr. many years ago. When I first met him, he had already been researching it for several years. And it really means self-awareness formulas. And I think that you're going to find it kind of interesting. It's hard to condense all of this into a short time and at the same time give you some basic understanding of something, especially if it's a rather involved system in terms of the background information. In making use of it, it's pretty straightforward. Joseph Sconia made it into a system that was usable and practical to be used in the clinic, and potentially certain people probably could make use of it themselves. And it probably would be a good self-exploratory experience to do that. But if you have significant issues that you want to deal with, or maybe have been working on for many years on your own, this can be an accelerated method of helping you get to the core of issues that have bugged you for a long time. Now, I mentioned before that this heavily involves energy. In fact, the organization was called Life Energy Research, and Joe had set up a foundation to do all this study and crunch huge amounts of data that he used to arrive at the system that now exists. The only thing that slowed this whole process down was the untimely death of Joe many years ago, and basically that is what caused me to come to an end in making use of it, was that there was no longer anyone to provide the materials that were on the old Apple IIe 5 1/4 floppy disk. Back in those early days, there was no internal hard drive in the computers, and so everything had to be loaded in each time from floppy disks. And once he was out of the picture, there was really no one available at the time to carry it on, so it kind of went on to the back shelf. And it eventually has been resurrected by his wife. She, for whatever reason, I really don't know the whole story behind it, kind of let it sit for a long time, but I think several things happened that caused her to bring it back up again and get into it, revise it, republish all the books. He wrote a tremendous amount of material. In the short years that he was here, he pumped out huge amounts of data and material, and I ended up with, I don't know, 20 or 30 different books and publications that he had put out, explaining different aspects of it and how to utilize it. Now, in terms of the therapeutics, he ended up utilizing a very wide range of methodologies: homeopathy, nutrition, amino acids, herbs, acupuncture, and so forth. He made use of all those, which in essence really is energetic in nature anyhow. And so by applying or making use of the right energies, he was able to activate the body to detox all the materials that were blocking or inhibiting the body's ability to take care of itself, and really do a good job in terms of getting people well. It took doctors of traditional medicine who kind of became enamored with it. It took a bit of a rethink, because when he started getting into the energetic side, medicine has been, since the time of, I guess, Galileo, almost, but in particular Newton, moved more and more toward the, what I call, materialistic, mechanistic side, that the body is nothing but a machine, and so forth. So anyone who comes along talking energetics, such as Dr. Samuel Hahnemann, who introduced homeopathy, he immediately was criticized and ridiculed, and the public was ultimately prejudiced against homeopathy, predominantly in this country, for many years, just because of a campaign to discredit it. It seemed to run counter to reason, especially materialistic reasoning, and so therefore they were successful in moving it aside. Now, the interesting thing is that foundations for all of this was laid a long time ago. I came into it because I was already into the energetic side, and right away I could see value in it, and I could see that it was a well thought out and comprehensive system in terms of the capabilities, and so it worked well for me, because I did not have to do a rethink of everything like some of these doctors do. Now, remember the last 2 or 3 broadcasts, we were talking about energy, we were talking about frequency, we were talking about resonance, we were talking about information, and so those are some of the key pieces of information that you need to get some type of understanding. Now, I've mentioned books many, many times, and I mentioned some last time that basically, if you were really intrigued about what I've been talking about over the last couple of years, you would probably have gotten already, so I don't want to be redundant. I did want to emphasize that the psychological side of energetics is very important, and in this country, and now spread around the world, is a type of energy psychology that utilizes the concepts, really, of Oriental medicine and the meridians and the acupoints, and that tapping on these acupoints will in some way affect the energy and help people actually get rid of a lot of negative inhibitions on the psychological, emotional side. This system, the SAF that we're talking about, basically deals with the whole person. It deals with the psychological, emotional, as well as the physical. And of course they run parallel. Now, Chinese medicine has said that for years, that the two are combined together. That if you have an organ out of balance, such as the liver, it can bring on an emotional state related to that, which is irritability and anger. On the other hand, if someone is in their life involved in a lot of issues that are creating a lot of anger and irritability in them, that can have a disturbing effect on the liver. So it's a two-way street, and it can't be separated. And so the Chinese, when they treated, it made no difference whether it was coming from the psyche to the liver or from the liver to the psyche. Whenever they gave the right treatment, both of those were improved. And so this approach, developed by Dr. Well, I didn't say doctor. He was one of these self-educated people that was extremely brilliant, and probably had he been educated in the proper way, he would never have come up with this, because he would have known it was ridiculous and couldn't possibly work. It would seem to me that if you go back historically and study the great innovations, they came from people who were poorly educated, i.e. Edison, for example, and was thought that they were actually not trainable, meaning they couldn't learn, and yet they thought in a different way. So it doesn't mean that because you don't have a big formal education that you don't know anything. In fact, people who learn because they're motivated to learn usually are more open because they don't have the previous prejudices that you get when you go through the traditional educational system. Supposedly it's scientific, but when you have a system that has a series of prohibitions about what you can think about something, and that you have to not look into those realms because everyone knows that they're not possible or not true, then you restrict or inhibit what you can learn. And so the people who have come up on their own or that have gone through some of the traditional education but departed from it are the ones who have made the big breakthroughs. And if you look back historically, you'll find that in most cases that's true, or at least a lot of cases. I guess I haven't counted, so I can't say with exactitude that that's the case, but I would say a high percentage of the wealthiest, the most successful, the most innovative, the most inventive minds have been minds that were not so contaminated with the traditional thinking patterns. Okay, I have to watch that we keep our time here. So I've introduced the system, and this is one of the books that's put out by Life Energy Research that is a reprint, or actually it was edited and then reprinted, on the SAF concept. And it's this is a good introduction, and you see that it looks like the sun had a lot of energy, because if you study into Joe's work, you will find that he was heavily into energy related to the sun and how we are affected by it. And some of this came about from some of his own challenges, his early health challenges and so forth, as it relates to sunshine and how his body reacted to it. Now, radiation and energy, you will find, comes up frequently in his books. In fact, one of his books was put out was called Project Isis, which is from ancient Egypt, the concept of Isis, and it's called The Fundamentals of Human Electricity. Now, those of you who have listened to my broadcast will know that we've talked a lot about how the human body works with the movement of electricity and electronics and proticity, etc., and how those are all important for your body to work properly. So Joe had tuned into that a long time ago, and he emphasizes quite a bit about the sun. And he wrote a book, in fact, called The Threat of the Poison Rain. Now, that's not R-A-I-N, it's R-E-I-G-N. In other words, the ruling of toxins and radiation. And he talked a lot about how you could detect and purge the body from a lot of that material. So that book has also been reprinted. So I think a good share of the ones, including his big one called the Promethean, lays the foundation for his thinking and rationale for developing this whole approach to detecting what's going on in the body and making corrections. But as happens so many times, a lot of the original motivation was because of some of his own issues. Now, another one of his books is called Light, Dark, the Neuron and the Axon, a lot about the nervous system and how it works. Very good material to get into, and as I say, they have put out most of the books, and I think they are about finished with the major ones. Now, he wrote a huge amount. I know, as I say, had 20 to 30 in my library that came from him, dealing with different aspects like homeopathy and allergies and herbs and so forth, all those different modalities as far as treatment were heavily tied into the system. And we need to talk just a little bit more about the energy side of it, because a lot of work, as I say, a lot of foundation was laid quite some time back, before Joe came along. I'm thinking all the way back to Dr. Kreil, George Kreil, who was the originator of the Cleveland the Cleveland Clinic system in Cleveland, which he was a tremendous innovator, way ahead of his time. He published a book back in the 1920s called The Bipolar Process of Living Tissue, where he already understood way back then how the body involved the use of electricity to work. And the bipolar process had to do with the positive and negative charges of electricity and how that was involved in the body functioning. And he went on to do some very interesting things in medicine, but of course, as always happens, once he's the originator is out of the picture, as the years go by, things get taken over and changed. And so Cleveland Clinic now is, at least it has been, a major center for specializing in cardiovascular problems, and in particular cardiovascular surgery. So they went ultimately heavy into surgery, and kind of got away from some of the original ideas. I think his son was involved for a while, and then a grandson, and now it's basically a traditional medical facility. And I doubt that probably any of the ideas that he talked about back in the 1920s are ever mentioned. I do have the book. Took me a long time to find it. Originally, I went to a book search company, and it took several months. They finally located a copy of it, and I think this has been several years ago. I think I had to pay $60 to get a copy of it. But it's a good book, worth reading, and since then I think some people have made copies of it available at a lot less money. But he did understand this whole concept of the body and electricity, and if you read his book, you'll see where he was warning that things that interfered with that electricity could be harmful, if not fatal, to the human body. Now, the other person that I have to bring up is, of course, Dr. Wilhelm Reich. I've mentioned him before. He was an MD psychiatrist, protege of Freud, and, of course, he ended up parting from Freud in terms of concepts, because Freud, went ultimately into the psychoanalytic concept of talking and I'm trying to uncover old problems, and to somehow, hopefully, by recalling things that happened, you would suddenly get better, which didn't quite work that way, but it did develop a big following and still has today a large following. But Reich went off a different direction, and he realized the electricity capability of the body, and he talked about body energies and energetics, and he also talked about something later, and this was his beginning because he was a psychiatrist, but as time went on and he studied more, he finally came to the realization that there's a lot deeper things about our whole world that we don't really understand. And we have developed theories about it, and those theories have been accepted as fact. And he was one that was not big on accepting something just because it's been the standard position. And so he questioned all the things he had been taught, especially in terms of biology and the human body. And interestingly, he uncovered some things about energy that comes in from space, in my mind, very likely from the sun, as Joe was talking about. And he called this energy orgon, which means organic energy, and that we have this perpetual creativity going on. In other words, this matter is being created constantly. Now, if you want some interesting reading, I didn't bring up his books, but I could have, because as time went on, he considered himself a biophysicist as opposed to just a physician and medical person, that he became a biophysicist. And so as he researched more and more, he set up a research laboratory up in Maine, Rangeley, Maine, and studied these energies. He developed a microscope system, not like the Royal Rife one that you hear a lot about, but a microscope system where he was able to get about 3,000 to 3,500 times magnification and see some very interesting things about matter. I'll just throw in one thing real fast. He recalled that when he was studying biology, and of course I remember it too because I went through the same process, they used to tell you, and I don't know what they do today, so I'm not sure they teach too much of anything, except to do how to do what you're told. Anyhow, that biology class that I was in, that would have been about the 7th grade, if I recall. We got to the point on microscopy and living organisms, and especially one-celled organisms. And so there's this old experiment where you take some water and you take some straw and you put it in the water and you just leave it there for several days. And after a while, you notice that these one-celled organisms start appearing in the water. And so then you can take them out and put them, just take a dropper out of that water, put it on a slide under the microscope, and you can see these one-celled organisms moving around. Now, had you done that when you first put the straw in, you would not find any. But as over several days, suddenly you could find these one-celled organisms. Well, the theory was that there were spores of these in the air, or they were on the straw, or whatever, and that in the water they became activated, and that produced these organisms. So that became the standard theory of biology. Well, Wilhelm Reich says, gee, I wonder if that's really true. So he decided he would do some further investigation. So he took an autoclave. And of course, you know, an autoclave is what they put things in to sterilize them. You put high temperature and you have high pressure. And the two of those will sterilize surgical instruments or whatever and get rid of viruses, get rid of anything that's on that, so that when it comes out of there, it is sterile. So he took the water and he took the straw and he put it in this autoclave, and he autoclaved it and kept it sealed so that when he took it out of the autoclave, there was no way the outside air could get into the container. And so he let it sit for several days, and then he started taking some samples out, and when he did, again, he did it in a way that it did not become contaminated by the outside air. And what he found is that there were little tiny blue glowing things bouncing around in the water. And as time went on, those continued to form until they formed into little one-celled organisms. And so he said that somehow this bioenergy, this organ energy, activates minerals and so forth, and other tissue, like from the hay and whatever, and begins to create life. And so he did a whole series of experiments, and his books are available, and he called these little units bions, and that they eventually changed or evolved into little living one-celled organisms. And then he went on to do all kinds of things, which we don't have time to talk about, but it all had to do with energetics. If you want an interesting read, you should read into some of his books. And also there is a biography written about him called Fury on Earth. And he was, of course, a man ahead of his time, like so many of these guys are. And he did a lot of other things, which we don't have time to get into, but they had all involved energies. And you'll find it very intriguing, and find that he finally got in trouble because he learned how to use these energies to help people get well, especially with things like cancer. And once that started happening, it became time to remove him from the picture, and they did, and I'm not even going to go into all the details about what happened, but he was the other person that laid a lot of information out related to energy in the body, and how when these energies are inhibited in the body by emotional issues, they can cause not only emotional problems but physiological problems. In other words, you can have a deterioration of tissue because you have the inhibition of energy movement into that tissue. Okay, so that kind of gives you some foundation. The Joe, I'm not sure if he was tuned in to Crowell's work or if he was tuned into Reich's work, because I did not see it mentioned. But that doesn't mean that he did not at some point come onto it and maybe gain some information from it. I don't know. What I do know is that Joe developed a very workable system, and it was interesting because he was able to gain information from the person either by specialized questionnaires or by infrared sensing. Now, at the point I got involved with his work was when he was utilizing a lot an infrared gun that reads at a short distance from the body or whatever you hold it near, reads the infrared material, or I should say energy coming off, and converts it into a degree reading so that you can tell what the temperature is. And you can do it in Celsius or the regular temperature Fahrenheit that we use. And from that, you could then feed this data into a computer program, and it would analyze it, and it would come up with a chain of numbers related to each of the organs in the body and glands and so forth. And anyhow, the old gun was approximately this big and about this big around, very heavy and very expensive, and it worked pretty good, but in fact it worked well enough that we had really good results with it. And as I say, I used it for quite some time. The only reason I quit was because of the unavailability of more of the disks and programs to make it work. So it kind of sat on the shelf as far as I'm concerned until I found out along the way that it had been resurrected. The programs had been rewritten from Apple into the PC and so forth so that they could be used today. And I'm just going to show you that this is the chart that he developed of the face. I don't know if you could kind of get a look at it. And there's 23 points that you measure on the face and forehead. And what he found that each of these points were infrared information coming to the surface from the brain via various muscle groups that, of course, are innervated by the brain, and that he could then get a handle on the various organs and so forth in the body. And the computer program that he had written would take this information and analyze it into a chain of disturbance from the time you're born up to present time. And he had assigned numbers based on the deterioration of the organs and glands in the body in a sequence based on how susceptible they were to damage. So, of course, number one on the chain, or number one in the system, happened to be the thymus. And so the thymus is the first thing that's affected when you're exposed to radiation or extreme disturbance. It could be actually emotional state can do it. It can cause the thymus to be disturbed, and it can start to malfunction. And of course, as you know, the thymus is extremely important to be able to activate T cells, which activates basically the whole concept of making antibodies and the immune system's ability to defend the body. That's why in cancer problems, happens that the thymus and spleen, of course, which is another part of the immune system, if the thymus is disturbed by, let's say, a bad emotional shock or a very powerful unresolved emotional state, it can wear down the thymus. Or if you're just under tremendous stress or some major shock, it can be depressed, or over time can erode to the point that it becomes non-functional. When the spleen or the thymus is non-functional, it cannot activate the T cells, which are called T cells from the thymus, and therefore your immune system doesn't work. And that's the big problem with cancer, is that you actually have two issues. One issue is that you have toxic materials or radiation which can disturb the DNA, and that's called carcinogenic. In other words, it disturbs the DNA in such a way that the DNA malfunctions. And the way that it malfunctions, it just starts to over-replicate the cells. And that's not bad enough. If it continues to do that, they disengage from connection to the body. And we've mentioned before about integrins and how they can cause the communication between every cell of the body so that everything is regulated and does what it's supposed to. And it disconnects and becomes a separate entity. And I always think of the movie Alien, that there's something growing in you that now is no longer what it was. If it was originally a liver cell, it's no longer a liver cell. It differentiates and becomes an amorphous blob, which also reminds me of an old science fiction movie called The Blob. And so it takes on a life of its own. Now, when that first happens, when that cell first mutates, there's a series of things start to take place. If the body is working properly, if the thymus is working properly, it activates the T cells, it activates antibody production, and it immediately sends out killer cells that go and kill it, and that's the end of it. In other words, it literally poisons and then digests this mutant cell, and it's all over. So with cancer, you have two problems. You have a mutagenic, carcinogenic substance, or energy, and it could be an energy. For example, X-ray and radiation have a mutagenic effect. They can have a carcinogenic effect. And when that happens, then the immune system's job is to take care of it. But if it's inactive, that doesn't happen. So you have an immune failure as well as a poison problem. And both of those together end up with a tumor or cancer. To get rid of those, of course, you have to do two things. You have to stop poisoning the cells. You have to activate the immune system to start breaking down the existing mutant cells, and the body can rid itself. And there's just a huge number of cases that show when the right thing takes place with the psyche, meaning you get rid of this deep stressor or whatever this emotional issue is, and when you do that, the body is able to actually get rid of the cancer, and you don't have to cut it out, you don't have to do all that. But of course, hardly anybody is dealing with the emotional side. They're all dealing with the physical issue, which is what regular medicine has done. They've become mechanistic, so their idea is that the problem is the tumor. And of course, the real problem is not the tumor. The real problem is a failure of the body to protect itself and a toxicity problem. And they're not going to deal with it. In fact, some of the tests that have been developed out of France at the Pasteur Institute to detect, I'm not even going to go into that because we've mentioned some of that work before, but it detects whether a substance is carcinogenic or not. In other words, there are some substances that change the genes, but it does not actually cause it to become carcinogenic. There are others that are mutagenic that do cause the carcinogenic effect, and that's when you're in trouble. Now, if you really want to know a lot more about this, we don't have time. We've mentioned it before when we did a big series of broadcasts on cancer. If you go back in the archive on YouTube, you should find a whole series on cancer. And what happened is that Dr. Hammer, who is an oncologist from Germany, got into this whole emotional issue and found that if he could get rid of the right emotional material, the tumor just shrunk up and disappeared. And of course, eventually, after several years, he was drummed out of Germany because it was a threat to the society, or I should say, the industry of cancer. Okay, so Joe's system was very simple in terms of implementing, because you could either answer a questionnaire or you could measure these points, which was a good survey, and you feed it into the computer and it prints out this chain of numbers. Now, I've mentioned before how information can be stored in different ways. It can be stored in geometric forms, and it can be stored in terms of number combinations or ratios. And those of you who heard me talk a little bit about radionics know that those were called rates. So in a sense, this is an informational system involving numbers. Now, there's some implications of all that which are beyond what we're going to talk about today that I'm looking into, but it aroused some other information that I know that, again, is almost unknown. But really cutting edge stuff. And I think that there's a way to apply this even more powerfully than it has in time past. But nonetheless, this awareness, this self-awareness issue is extremely important, because as you look at these numbers in this chain, you have the first number on the left, which tells you what's going on right now, and you have the last number on the right, which is where things started in your early childhood at birth. And as you look at it, there's a way of analyzing it that shows in different periods of your life how this progressed from one organ to another and one gland to another until the present time. Now, there's a third issue, which is a core issue, which is in the background, and that kind of runs all along in the background, influencing you and your health. Now, that's the physical side, but there's an emotional side that goes with each of those. So every time a different organ becomes problematic, and you're now dealing with issues related to that, you also end up dealing with certain emotional issues related to that. Now, Joe had worked all this out, and when you do those measurements now, a practitioner can sit down with you and go over this whole chain, and it will bring to your mind, and that's what I've seen happen. You say, well, here, when you were born, this was going on, and here's the emotional state that was going on. You know, do you have any connection, or does that have some meaning to you? And what it does, it starts activating in the background what's going on with you that you may have forgotten about for years as far as causative issues, and did not realize how over the years it progressed more and more and more to bring you up to today. So I think that kind of gives you a little bit of a feel of what it's all about. And as I say, those numbers represent information, and information has to do with making change in matter as well as emotions. And so it lends itself to being a very powerful system of making tremendous change in people, and especially uncovering this progression of disturbance and how it's affected you over the years and brought you to where you are right now. I believe that's enough to provoke your thinking about all of this. Now, this is another one of the big books from way back. I just happened to have it out, and I thought, well, I'll hold it up. It's called SAF Key, and that's another aspect which we didn't really talk about, but it's probably not a bad idea just to mention it, because each of these numbers in certain groupings will actually take you certain directions, meaning certain kinds of illnesses can develop, or disturbances to functions of the body can develop. and it has to do with what are called chains. A chain of a certain group of numbers represents a group of organs that are disturbed and a group of emotional states. And so it gives you a good indication. If you haven't, you're likely to be moving toward things like arthritis, diabetes, all kinds of problems. And it all has to do with these numbers. Now, it's not a diagnostic system per se, but it's, again, an awareness system that you might want to look into those areas, and you might want to make some changes so that that doesn't happen. The nice thing about it, it could be highly predictive. So I hope I've just given you enough to tweak your interest, and I have started using it again in the clinic, and the infrared reader that was so big, heavy, and expensive has shrunk up much smaller and much more sensitive. The new electronics make it very simple and easy to maneuver, and so in just a few minutes you can run through and read the 23 connection points of infrared to what's going on in your system and where the disturbances are, and it becomes a very useful tool. Now, it's interesting because I'll just throw this in real fast. I was introduced to a Russian system a few years ago that's being built over in Moscow, and they did a reading on me with it, but the primary readout is done with infrared. And so I thought that was interesting, that it was measuring how your body reacted. And in this case, they're exposing you to different frequencies, which have to do with different parts of the body, and then reading your body reaction via the infrared. And so this isn't, something outlandish. This is something that other people have picked up on, but have not made it quite into the system that was developed by Joe Sconia. So I will await any comments you want to make on the website, and criticisms, questions, etc. And if I get enough, maybe we'll go a little bit more into detail about it. But it is now available at my clinic, the system, and I think it's going to prove, in fact, I'm sure it's going to prove a tremendous addition. And I was at a point where I was looking for some other ways of getting into, especially tying into the emotional and physical tied together, because I've studied Oriental medicine. I know certain relationships, but Joe was able to take it a lot further and a lot more detailed and specific, and I've been fascinated, and I think you will find the same thing to be true. Okay, go to our webcast again and be sure and peruse through it. And I am in the process of putting up a page. There's a lot of work to be done on it, so it's probably going to be a couple, 3 weeks or maybe longer yet before it's up there. But we'll talk a little bit more about it and tell you about the books that are available more and what each of them are and so forth, and give you some more details about it, so that if it's something that grabs your interest, you might want to look into it further. Otherwise, don't forget to click the link to our site on alternative health and prevention, and leave your comments either on YouTube or on our site, and be sure and register on our site if you would like to be notified each week by email what the subject is going to be that we're going to be discussing. And of course, we're not going to be harassing you every time you turn around with a bunch of email trying to sell you something. Basically, we're just using it to announce what's happening. And so it goes out one time a week. It was nice to be with you again, and so our next broadcast, be healthy.